So today is lesson 6, and it's the first of 2 lessons we're going to do with security in ASP.NET. So we had a quick look at the OWASP top 10 that describes common security vulnerabilities and steps we can take to secure our applications. So Microsoft gives us this identity library, and there's 2 packages that have already actually been added to our .NET Duds store, which we'll look at. So actually, let's open up. I'm going to open up 2 projects. I'm going to open up the project we've been working on. We're going to keep working on it today. Here's my .NET Duds project. I've also created a second project where I use the same .NET Core MVC template, but that project, I didn't choose any authentication options when I set the project up. So I'm going to open up that one as well so that we can compare the setup between the project that has authentication enabled and a project with no authentication. So I'm not really using this website for anything. So the 2 libraries that 2 of the things we'll see in our .NET Duds store is we've got this Microsoft.ASP.NET Identity Core library. We also have the Identity Entity Framework library. And these libraries were added to our project automatically at the time we created the project. You can see them in your project. Just close everything up. You can see these under dependencies and packages. If you open your project, you'll see here's the ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework Core, as well as the ASP.NET Core Identity.UI. So these packages are here because they contain a lot of the code and infrastructure we need for implementing security in our application. In my project with no authentication, you'll notice that we don't have any packages installed. So these libraries are not here in this case. We can add them later if we want to, but the easiest way to implement security is just do it when you create the project. Otherwise, there's a fair bit we would have to do to add security into a project that was created without it. So these classes are primarily concerned with managing user accounts and user roles. Okay, so we're going to look at both of these things today. And these packages, they kind of sit in between our application code and our database. Now, what we're going to do with our clothing store today, it's sort of based on this tutorial from Microsoft. I've put this, so these slides are on Blackboard and so is the link. I'll just show you the tutorial quickly. I've also linked to it separately on Blackboard. Here's the tutorial here. So this walks you through step by step, creating an application from the very beginning, configuring ASP.NET Identity. So we're going to do a lot of these things within our store, but this tutorial link is here for you as a reference. So before we kind of start into this, we have a couple of key terms that we need to define. This is a great question for a job interview for a junior developer. When we're talking about security, we've got 2 important concepts we need to distinguish between. They're related, but they're not the same. We've got authentication on the one hand, we've got authorization on the other hand. How would you explain if I were to ask you in a job interview to distinguish between authentication and authorization? What would you say?
Authentication.
Wait, go ahead.
I was going to say authentication is are you who you say you are?
Right.
And authorization is, are you allowed to do this?
That's a great answer, Jeffrey. Thank you. So authentication is about identity. And it's it's the first level of security. Do we know who this person is, or are they an anonymous user of our application? And when we implemented security, probably when you did it in your PHP course, we really only implemented authentication. We built a registration and a login page, and then we controlled access within the website depending on whether the user was logged in or not. So we just did authentication. Authorization is the next level. It's once we've identified who a user is, we now want to figure out what roles are they in and what permissions do they have. So once we know who you are, we've authenticated you, we now want to know what are you allowed to see and do. Okay? So authentication is the first level, authorization is the second level. So we should be able to implement authentication probably in the first part of class today, and then we'll be able to implement authorization in the second part of class. So schematically within ASP.NET, it looks something like this. So we're using identity first to authenticate. And there's a few different ways we could do this. We can authenticate locally with a username and password in our database. That's what we're going to start with this week. But we can also authenticate with other types of authentication. We could do Windows authentication, which doesn't really make a lot of sense in a web context unless we're building an intranet internally for our organization. But we could use third-party authentication, like let's say Google sign-in, Facebook login. And we'll implement those into our clothing store next week. So there's our authentication piece. And then our authorization piece has to do with the roles that are attached potentially to each user. So when we create our project, when we created our clothing store and when we created your assignment and we changed the authentication from none to individual user accounts, what this does is actually puts a migration in our project that's going to create a bunch of tables in the database for us that are used for storing users and roles. This diagram is maybe a little hard to see on my slide, but I've put on Blackboard the ASP.NET identity tables, and I've made it bigger so you can see what this diagram looks like. Whoops, I should update this. Pardon me, I have a more current, this version is old and has been changed. So bear with me, I'll update the diagram. I thought I did. Here's the current version. It has changed. Somebody mentioned that security is always changing. So these tables that come with identity have been changed a few times. This is the latest version that should match what we have. So if you refresh your lesson 6 folder, we can have a look at this diagram. So in our database, when we use identity, we're going to get 7 tables. Now, we're not really concerned with all of them. The primary table is the ASP.NET users table, and you can see the properties in here. So it stores a username, an email. We have a Boolean field if we want to confirm registrations before accounts are active. Passwords are hashed. They're also salted using this security stamp field. We have the ability to set 2-factor authentication or to lock out user accounts. So we're going to work with this table today. We're going to work with the ASP.NET roles table. We want to add a couple of roles to our database. We want an administrator role and we want a customer role. And then in between these two tables, we have a junction table, ASP.NET user roles. So users and roles have a many-to-many relationship. One role can have many users, and one user can be in many roles. So we've got a junction table in the middle that stores the connections between users and roles. Which user is in which role? Okay, we're not really going to get in this course, the tokens, claims, those are a bit beyond the scope of our course. So if I go and look at my database, I'll just open up my database in Management Studio. And we're going to need to do some work in our databases today. So I would recommend that you also open up Management Studio and get connected to your database. Whatever you're using for your clothing store, whether you're working locally or whether you're using your database on Azure like I am.
Quick question about that. I had a phone call from an Azure support saying that like that my trial is considered a free trial and that it expires on November 1st instead of having a student trial. Is that something I should have with you about an office hour?
Yes, that would be a good idea, Lindsay.
Okay, great.
Now let me just check my store. I'm going to need to connect to my database. I may have deleted my database, so I might have to recreate it. Oh, there it is. That was my old one. So here's my Wednesday database. And you'll notice I have all of these tables in here. I've got the 7 tables that start with ASP.NET. So where did those tables come from? How did they get there? Well, when we created our project and we changed the authentication from none to individual user accounts, if you look in your data folder under migrations, there's a migration at the top. There's no date or timestamp. It's all zeros, but then it's called Create Identity Schema. If I open that file, this code was auto-generated by Visual Studio as soon as we created our project with individual user accounts for authentication. So we can see the script here that builds the ASP.NET roles, the table ASP.NET users, and creates all the foreign key and relationships. So the first time we ran a migration, we ran the update database command. This migration, this was the first one in the project before the other migrations we created. So this is what generates the tables in your database. Again, in my project with no security, I don't have this migration. I don't even have a data folder here. So that data folder gets created if we pick authentication when we create our project. So a lot of the infrastructure for security is already here, right? We've got tables in our database already, and we've got the references we need to the identity packages. So the main classes to work with identity, most of the logic lives in those libraries. So we don't need to make our own models and controllers for user management. The identity library already has all those functions. So there's 2 primary classes we're going to work with. The first one is the identity user class. That class is basically used for authentication, and it's mapped to the ASP.NET users table. There's also an identity role class, and it maps to the ASP.NET user roles table. So we'll work with these classes when we want to save users or put users into roles. So our website is actually set up already to register users and allow them to log in. We just have to make one very small change to our startup.cs file. So let's open up that file. in our project. I'll open up Startup. And in your Startup file, scroll down to the Configure Services method, which starts on line 28. And if you look on lines 33 and 34, this is actually configuring our database to manage our users. So add default identity using our application DB context. Now there's one thing on this on these two lines we need to change. If you look at the code I've highlighted in blue, for our purposes, there's one thing here I want to change. You have any idea from looking at that what change we should make? Or what the problem with this code is? Yeah. Right, let's change true to false. Why would it be a good idea to change the required confirmed account to false? Taylor and Mike, you guys have the right answer. What made you say that? Right. This will, if this is set to true, it's going to try to send a confirmation email. We don't have a local mail server configured, so we're going to get an error that the library is going to try to send a confirmation email, but it's going to throw an error saying there's no mail server configured. So for now, let's change this from true to false on line 33. So as soon as a user registers, they can use their account. They don't need to respond to a confirmation email in this case. So this is actually making our site, our security a little less robust. You know, the point of having that confirmation email, it makes our site more secure, but without a mail server right now, we can't really use that feature. So just change true to false on line 33. And then I'm going to click on debug and start without debugging. And let's launch our site. So our clothing store opens, and we've automatically got links to register and log in the nav bar. Again, we get these because we added security when we created the project. So if I go to register, I've got a form, and if I go to login, I've got a form. Let's try these out. So I'm going to try to register as user at gc.ca. And if I put in a short password, some jQuery validation runs automatically and says my password's got to be at least 6 characters long. So I'll put it in as test and test. So I'm going to try to register. Yeah, I know, 100's kind of crazy. We can change it. So these are just the default settings, but we could change that if we wanted to. Jillian, we'll look later at where we can change that. So I'm going to try and register this way. User at gc.ca, test as the password. And now some additional validation runs that's going to enforce a strong password rule. At least one special character, at least one digit, and at least one upper and lower case. So I'll follow these rules. I'll put this login in the chat, although I'm going to delete it later. So go ahead and try to sign up. I'm going to use this login. So I'm going to use capital T and then lowercase est $123 as my password. I'm going to register. And now if you notice, my header's changed. My register and login links have disappeared. My username is here, and now I have a log out button. So this suggests that it actually created a user account for me. If I want to check, I can go to Management Studio. And if I click on my ASP.NET users table, I can right-click it, select my top 1,000 rows, and there should be one record in the table now. So I now have one user. Now notice the ID that's used. Identity doesn't store the IDs numerically. It stores them as a GUID, a globally unique identifier, like we used last week in our photo upload. So here's my username. My password is hashed. It uses a salt value in this security stamp. Yes, that's right. It does. It's all done. We're not using two-factor authentication. So now I have a user account. Well, let's just confirm that the login actually works. So as soon as I register, I'm logged in as this user. I'm going to log out. And I'm going to go back to try and log in. So now my login works. If I log out and try again, I'll put in, some other user. I also want to make sure that this blocks me. Yep, so now I get invalid login attempt. So the register and login functions, they work completely right out of the box. We don't have to make any changes to get those to work. That's right. Now I'm going to try to register another user. What happens if I try to register with the exact same credential that I already created? So the identity library will tell me the username's already taken. It's going to do a check for duplicates to ensure that we don't have multiple users with the same email address. So all of kind of a lot of the best practices here of what we'd want to do is, yeah, that's right, Kevin. Okay, great question. So where is the code? And, in my class on Monday, one student said, I could see the register page, but I wanted to make changes. Like I could see it in my browser, but I couldn't find it in Solution Explorer so I could make changes. So we're not going to change it right now, but I'll show you how to find it because later on we do want to change the code. So I'll show you where it is and we'll come back to it later. So under Solution Explorer, it's kind of hidden. Like if you search for register, if I do a find in files and search for register, and find all, we see the link in our shared login. That's the only reference to register. So the file looks like it doesn't exist, like it's kind of hidden somewhere, and it actually is. So here's how we could open up both the view as well as the code that's attached to the view. We've got this folder called areas. And under here, there's an identity area. And under here, there's a pages. Now there's nothing in here. There's just this view start right now. So if we want to see the register page and potentially change it, here's how we do it. click on this Pages folder under Areas, Identity, and Pages. And then I'm going to right-click it, and I'm going to choose Add. And then I'm going to choose New Scaffolded Item. So I'll show you that again. You're going to open up the Areas folder, and then the Identity folder, and the Pages folder. And if you right-click on Pages, you choose Add, New Scaffolded Item. And this will bring up another little dialog box. So we get this window that says Add New Scaffolded Item. And over here on the left in this little navigation tree, I want to pick Identity. That then gives me this option in the middle. There's only one option here. It says Identity as well. Adds code required for using .NET Core Identity in the application. So this is what we want. Pick Identity, and then I'll click the Add button. I'll leave the screen up for a few seconds if you're a bit behind. So our scaffold tool is going to run. It should default at the top to use our shared layout. If not, we could always browse to views, shared, and layout at the top. And then the item we want is the second last one in the last column, account register. And then under here, we have to add our data context class, which is our application DB context file. So this is going to put a copy of the register file into our Solution Explorer so that we could modify any of the HTML in the view, or we could modify any of the C# code behind it. So I'll click Add. And we'll let this run. Running a bit slow for me today. Doesn't usually take this long. Hopefully it's going to complete. Okay, so it says support was added to the project. There's a link here if we want more details. And now under Pages, I now have a subfolder called Account. And under here, I've got the register.cs.html. Here's the view. So if we wanted to change anything in the user interface, we would change it. And then there's a little triangle that I can expand beside it. And here's the C# file. So again, the identity doesn't use the MVC pattern. It's not using a controller and a model. So here's all the code that runs on our register page. So Jillian, if we wanted to change the password length, you think 100 is too long, you could change it here to say 20. And if you wanted to change the minimum to say 8, which is more common, we could change it here. So Daniel, we don't actually see the code where it does the duplicate check, but here's what happens. A new identity user instance is created with this user's email address. And then it uses the user manager class, calls a method called create async. that also passes in the password for hashing. If I look at this method, I don't think we can actually see the duplicate check. The code happens behind the scenes in the identity library. It happens inside of this identity entity framework core. So it's a hidden method inside create async. So we don't actually see it. But we try it and we know it works. So there's a little bit of sort of magic there. Right. So we don't actually see that duplicate check, but we know that it's there. Right. We will make some changes in here later on. So we can register a user now, and we can log in. So what we now want to do is let's add some authentication into our project so that somebody has to log in order to access. Not sure what happened here. I'll just restart my app. I'm not sure why it died on me. So I can register and log in, but everything on the app is public, right? So as an anonymous user, I'm not logged in here. We can tell from my navbar. But anybody can come to the site and manage the product catalog. I could create any categories. I could delete all the products. I could set all the price to 1 cent. I can do anything I want without logging in. So let's add some basic authentication so that before a user can access the categories or products, they've got to log in. We also then want to show or hide these links in the navbar depending on if the user is authenticated or anonymous. So anonymous users won't see categories and products. An authenticated user will see them. So let's deal with the links first. So we only probably need 5 lines of code to do all of this, which is great. Let's deal with our navbar first. We want an if statement here that shows or hides these 2 links depending on whether or not our user is logged in. So let's open up our views shared layout that you'll probably become pretty familiar with by now. So we've got 2 links here from lines 27 to 32. These are our categories and product links. So we want to hide them unless the user is logged in. So we were going to wrap these links in an if statement. So checking is really easy. We can just check the user object. So user is a keyword. It's a class in the identity library. This is why I know some students emailed me saying, I'm trying to create a user controller and user model in my assignment, and I can't use the class user with a capital U. Why? The reason is the class is reserved. It's already declared in the identity library. So you can't make your own class called user with a capital U. So we can check if user.identity is authenticated. This will tell us if the user is currently logged into the site or is anonymous. So I'll just save that. And actually, I tried this in class yesterday. People found it easier. Let me go here for a second. I'll put the code on paste bin. Actually, you know what? It's easier on paste of code. Because sometimes me pasting code into the chat can be difficult to read. I'll put this link in the chat, and you can grab the code from here. So there are new links. Let's try this out. So I'm not logged in now. I'll refresh my site. My categories and products links, those should disappear now. So as an anonymous user, I can no longer see them. As soon as I log into the site, my links come back. So by default, Identity is using a session, but it also offers cookie authentication as well. So I'm going to try it in a separate browser. So I'm going to log in Chrome. And if I check remember me, this will write a cookie, an encrypted cookie in Chrome. I'm logged in Chrome, so I get my links. If I close Chrome and come back, I'm still logged in. So that remember checkbox will write a cookie. If you don't check the box, you're using a session. So if you close the browser, you're going to be logged out. Okay. So there's our check in our nav bar. Simple check in the view if our user.identity is authenticated. If they're logged in, let them see these things. If they're not logged in, they can't see those links. Well, we will add that, Mike. It's that these pages are really our admin pages. These aren't here for the shoppers. This is for managing the inventory of the store. So we will build a separate link and separate set of pages. We don't really want to show the list of categories like this anyway. We'll present it in a more kind of shopper-friendly way. So now when I log out, my links disappear. However, we haven't really controlled access. Even when I'm logged out, if I know the URL, I can still go back and modify anything in the product catalog or the categories. So we now want to we need to implement authentication in our controller as well. This isn't going to take us very long. 1 to 2 lines of code is all we need. So I'm going to open up my categories controller first. And I want to change it so that all of the views, everything is blocked to anonymous users. Only a logged in user can access them. So doing this in our controller is really easy. To make our controller or a single method in the controller available to authenticated users, we just add the authorized keyword in square brackets above either the class or the method. And if we want to override it, we can make a method public with allow anonymous. So we'll just add these to our controller to see how they work. Open up your categories controller. And on line 13, you'll find the class definition for categories controller. So above this, I want to make all the methods for authenticated users only. So I'll just add the authorize decorator here. Now it does require a reference, so I'll need to accept the suggested reference, which is to Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Authorization. So I'll accept that reference, and it'll add line 10. I'm going to save that change, and now I want to test this out. How does it work? So I've declared authorize at the class level. Bring my window over here. So I'm anonymous right now. We can see this because I don't see the categories and products links, and my nav bar shows register and log in. I'll refresh my categories view. And now I get redirected to the login screen. And if we look at my URL, it also shows which URL I tried to load but got blocked from. So if I log in, once my identity is validated, it will take me back to categories because that was the resource I had requested. So when I'm logged in, I can go anywhere. If I log out, I'll try some of the other methods. I'll try categories create, locked, categories, edit, blocked. Yes, it is. Jeffrey, we'll see why in a minute. Yeah, so it's really, when we call it this way, it's doing authentication, but we can add additional parameters onto that for authorization. Yeah, they've done it. Really, Microsoft has done a great job with this. They really have. Whenever I teach this class, there are people who enter the course talking about how much they hate Microsoft. And as soon as they start to work with these tools, they think, wow, this makes life as a developer so much easier. Right? Now, so we've controlled access at the class level with one line of code, which is great. But sometimes we need more granular control. Like we may have in a controller, we might want most of it to be private, but we may have one or two methods that should be available to the public. So in that case, we can add allow anonymous above the method to let users in just to that one method. So let's add this to our details method. So you'll find your details method on line 32 or thereabouts. So here, I'm going to add the allow anonymous decorator. So this will be the one method that we can call in this controller where we don't have to be logged in. And I'm putting it on details because details is read-only. a user can see data, but they can't change it, add it, delete it. So I've added this above my details method. And now I can try it out. I can go to categories, details, and even though I'm anonymous and not logged in, I can't see the links. I have no username showing up. So I can access details as soon as I click on one of the links. I'm locked, but details I'm allowed in. Sierra, that's a great question. That's one thing we could do, but what we'll do, we'll actually build a separate control. We could do it that way, but I'm going to create a separate controller for the store. I'll call it like store controller or shop controller, and we'll add some very different formatting to that page. Showing data, showing our lists in an HTML table, like we've got on products. This is kind of a useful way to manage the data if we own the store, we work for the store. Maybe not ideal way to present, we don't typically see tabular data on an e-commerce site. We could show the products like this to customers, but I have an idea to maybe reformat it, because we also want different links. We'll want like add to cart links, for example, instead. So we will build it. Yeah, so these pages are this is basically the admin end of the site now. So customers won't see these pages. I mean, we could do it like you said, like you're suggesting. We could keep this page for customers, allow access, but just do an authentication check around the links. So the links might be hidden depending on the user. I think that's how I did it in our PHP class. So there'd be nothing wrong with doing it that way. I'm going to make a separate controller entirely for the actual store part. So we kind of have the categories and products controllers for the administration, and we'll make a store controller or a shop controller for the shopping experience and shopping cart. Okay, so that's authentication. So really, the big work is checking the authentication box when you create your project and running your first migration. Other than that, I mean, look how little code we added. We added one authorized statement, one allow anonymous statement, and one if statement was all the code that we had to add in order to implement authentication in the app. So it's noon, we're off to a good start. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna push what we've done up to GitHub now, and I'm gonna stop my recording. I'm gonna go brew myself a big pumpkin spice coffee, because it is the time of year, and we'll come back in 10 minutes, and then we're gonna take the security model to the next level by implementing authentication. Yes, Hamley's at Manette's Point and Yonge Street. Best coffee in the city. I highly recommend it. Okay, I will be back with you guys shortly.